Asia Society Policy Institute. Thanks for stopping in.
Good to be with you and good to be in Paris.
Lots to talk about war in Europe, obviously, and its escalation. It's got our undivided attention. Let's begin, though, by speaking with the former China scholar that you are, and current China scholar, I should say, since you're the president of the Asia Society, opening up a branch here in Paris, I believe. Is that it?
That's true. We're here to open Asia Society France, and we've got a good band of supporters, and we hope to work with French foreign policy think tanks, the French government, and others engaging the great challenges of Asia, including China's rise.
Right, and then I want to get to that. History-changing events happening here in Europe. They're also happening in the coming days in Beijing, with the opening of a Communist Party Congress that's set to lift the unwritten rule of term limits for Chinese presidents and cement Xi Jinping's stature as the most powerful leader of his country since Mao Zedong. Is he crossing the Rubicon, or this cementing of a centralized power in Beijing is something that happened long ago?
Well, the centralization of power in Beijing was probably achieved in 1949. The centralization of power in the hand of a single person, that's something relatively new. In fact, that's what the Chinese system vowed they would never do after the end of the Cultural Revolution.
So this third term is, in effect, one-man rule.
It's turning that way radically, and the principles of collective leadership, which the party explicitly re-endorsed back in 1981 to deal with the problems of the Cultural Revolution, have been quietly junked. So Xi's power over personnel, over ideology, over politics, over policy, it's unprecedented. He is the most powerful leader, the paramount leader, and the most powerful since Mao Zedong.
And how's that going down?
Well, if you're on the wrong side of it, rather badly, because in the last 10 years, he's got to this position by purging literally millions of people in the Chinese Communist Party, by disciplining them, some of them being imprisoned, and anyone who's loomed as a real central threat to his political authority have been put on trial as leading anti-party cliques. So Xi Jinping is a master Machiavellian. So his power, I think, right now is beyond dispute. The question is how he uses that power in terms of the future direction of economic policy and foreign policy.
Kevin Rudd, we all remember that Apec summit where you addressed the then president Hu Jintao in Mandarin, and it was it was 2007, but it seems like but it seems like a million years ago. How much has this China changed, particularly since COVID?
This China has changed a lot since 2012, which is when Xi Jinping was elected. Two or three things have really changed. If you look carefully, as I do now as the head of a think tank, at the evolution of Xi Jinping's ideology, because in a Marxist-Leninist system, ideology is the cornerstone from which the rest of policy proceeds. He's turned the party to the Leninist left. He has turned the economy more to the Marxist left. And he's turned foreign and security policy in a more assertive form to the nationalist right. These are big changes at the ideological level, and they've been translated through to instruments of policy which actually have an effect in the real world.
You had the impression with COVID that the nation's become more insular. They're still applying this zero COVID policy. Common thinking was that it would be lifted once the Congress was over. Now we're wondering if that's going to happen.
Well, I think the Chinese Communist Party would definitely like to lift it, but given that the leader has already proclaimed victory, a people's victory over COVID, it would be bad political karma for the bans to be lifted, the travel bans to be lifted, and the lockdowns released, if in fact COVID breaks out all over the place. At the same time, they know the economic and social cost is huge. My prediction is, once the Congress is done, you'll see from about December the incremental rolling out of a series of trials of what is now the new model of COVID management in Hong Kong. Travel is now permitted within Hong Kong and from Hong Kong to the rest of the world, but there is still a lighter form of individual medical surveillance.
Surveillance is, of course, one of those big issues. There's always this pact, wasn't it? The Chinese stay out of politics and the government takes care of them. We have a surveillance state in China, and we have seen a bit of blowback, particularly over these COVID lockdowns.
That's true. Chinese people are like people anywhere. They don't like all the details of their life being watched by the state. Some things they're embarrassed about. Well, most human beings are embarrassed about some aspects of their private behaviour at some stage in their life. But now, because of the advanced surveillance systems the Chinese have either bought from abroad or perfected at home, social credit scores, facial recognition, iris recognition, an ability to frankly produce a quick spreadsheet of where you've been as an individual citizen on a given day. Obviously, people don't like it, but Xi Jinping is all-powerful, and there's no organised force in Chinese politics to undo this trend towards the Leninist left in Chinese politics.
We've seen the U.S. president blow back on this with measures to curb cooperation in exports when it comes to things like technology, artificial intelligence. But were we blind to it before, just in the same way that we were blind to the risks of purchasing natural gas from Russia?
Well, there's a big debate now about the extent to which opening to China over 35 years provided some of the capabilities which China now either deploys militarily externally or internally in the surveillance of their own people. But there is little point in actually we're crying over spilt milk. The key question is, what about the future? And my argument about the future is that we are now, as countries belonging to the democratic world around the world, whether it's in Asia or Europe or in North America, beginning to develop a coordinated strategy for responding to China, which keeps the doors open, but which begins to draw a series of strategic red lines as well.
So you're saying, in effect, that we're at a moment in history where security trumps economic interests.
The interesting thing about the Chinese domestic narrative on the very question you raise is it too has changed. When Deng Xiaoping replaced Mao, he basically said in Chinese, 经济为纲, the economy is dominant overall. In fact, his ideological proclamation was, it's glorious to get rich. Now, that's not exactly a Marxist-Leninist precept, but that governed what happened in China for 35 years. Xi Jinping has changed that and put politics in command of economics through ideology, but in his most recent year or two, with identification of a range of security threats at home and abroad, security begins to dominate all. And one of the things I look for in his work report to the 20th Party Congress this Sunday is the extent to which we see new language emerge about the centrality of security over all.
Yet he's supposed to be talking up this notion of common prosperity, trying to reduce inequality within China.
That's true. As I said, I think there have been 2 or 3 shifts ideologically. The one we've just discussed on politics, which is pushing it to the Leninist left, more party control and more surveillance, more security. But pushing the economy to the Marxist left means now more radical proposals on the table for wealth redistribution. The Chinese private sector weren't told that when they began this sort of Deng Xiaoping revolution some decades ago, which is why you're beginning to see a slowing in the Chinese economy as firms begin to retire or reduce their foreign direct investment levels.
Kevin Rudd, Australia's a long way away from Kherson and Mykolaiv. And what was your reaction, though, when you've seen the way things have escalated so much in the last 3 weeks?
Well, all of us look at Ukraine as fellow democracies with not just concern, but with anger and with a sense of, I think, profound solidarity with the Ukrainian people and with Zelensky's administration. Even somewhere as remote as Australia, geographically from this theatre, rolling around Ukraine at present, you have probably 100 or so Australian armoured personnel carriers, which we have provided to the Ukrainian government. We're not members of NATO. We have no obligation to do so. But we thought it was the right thing to do as a country and as a government. But when you see this most recent escalation, particularly Vladimir Putin's indiscriminate targeting of civilians in Kyiv, and as we've just seen on your screen, people driving along a road, these represent a series of war crimes which ultimately this system in Russia must be held to account on.
We had the French president tweeting first in French and now in English. We do not want a world war. This after Paris and London joined Washington and Berlin in pledging air defense systems for Ukraine. Your thought on the language, the messages that are being sent to Vladimir Putin?
Well, obviously, Putin, who has suffered enormous setbacks in the battlefield, both in northeastern Ukraine, southeastern Ukraine, in the last couple of months, is feeling politically and militarily desperate. Secondly, that explains, I think, the sudden articulation of the tactical nuclear threat. Thirdly, he's also under pressure from China, because if you look carefully at the Chinese language on Putin and Russia in the last little while, they begin to distance themselves from the God almighty mess that Putin has found himself in Ukraine. But when Putin's response is to continue to escalate in order to somehow induce Ukraine or force NATO partners in fear to the negotiating table, it's a fundamental tactical and strategic miscalculation. Because as you've seen with today's decision by the Europeans to provide air defence system, what does it do? It invites further military assistance.
One final question. We have some big diplomatic rendezvous coming up. There's going to be an Apec meeting in Thailand, followed by a G20 in Bali. The French president is going to go to Apec. It's a first. Emmanuel Macron will be the first of his kind. What's that all about?
Well, Apec actually began, would you believe it, as an Australian diplomatic initiative way back in the 1980s, because we formed the view that these then middle-sized economies in Asia, based on our analysis, were going to grow into something very big. So we formed the Asia-Pacific Economic Council, or Council for Cooperation. It's an economic body, but it was the first body in the entire region to bring together heads of government on a regular basis. Prior to that, there was no summit. There was no EU, obviously, equivalent institution, not even an OSCE, a nothing.
And what's France's president doing there?
Well, because we regularly invite significant international leaders. I think the view of Emmanuel Macron since his re-election here in France is that he's a global leader. He's not just a European leader. And on the big question for the Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific region is strategic stability between China and the United States, and how do we maximize continued economic growth while minimizing the risk of war. France has a legitimate voice to bring to the table, and a welcome voice.
All right. I want to thank you so much, Australia's former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, today President of the Asia Society, for being with us.
Good to be here.